Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Tony Martin Vegi. And I just want to say thank you to the FAIR Institute and to the Ohio chapter for having me here today. Um, just before I get started, I want to briefly introduce myself more than I already did. I currently am working at Netflix doing quantitative risk in the Bay Area in California. At Netflix, we're almost doing FAIR exclusively. We do have a couple other quantitative models that we use for specific risk scenarios, but we converted our most of our quantitative models over to FAIR about a year and a half ago. I'm also the co-chair of the San Francisco chapter of the FAIR Institute, and I'm also on the board of the Society of Information Risk Analysts. It's another organization that's dedicated to advancing quantitative risk techniques. So if you're interested in that, please Google CIRA and you can check that out. So I'm going to spend my session here today talking to you all about some important ideas I think that will help advance our profession. And a common theme of mine that I like to talk to people about and write about, and I've also noticed from other people in the field, is this idea that those of us in the information risk profession are constantly inventing solutions for problems that have actually been solved for in the past. The answers are there. All we, excuse me, all we need to do is take a look at how people in other fields and other professions solve those similar or same problems, and often we'll find the answer. So what I want you all to do is just for a moment, do this with me. So try to forget about cyber risk. Forget about information security risk, operational risk, the types of risk that you all quantify. And the reason for it is in this talk, I want to try to reframe the way we approach risk. Now, if you think about what do you do when you make a risk assessment, any type of risk assessment? It's essentially a forecast. You're making a forecast. You use some part historical data, some part conjecture, a little bit of expert judgment. Hopefully, we're all using a little bit of math. And if we had people from other professions in this room or this virtual room, like Vegas bookmakers or meteorologists, war planners, people that are exploring for oil and gas, and they heard the way I described a forecast, they would all say, oh yeah, I do that too. That sounds very familiar. And there's many professions that perform forecasting, and we really all have something in common. We're trying to bring some sense of order to an uncertain world. And some of the very first philosophers and thinkers sought to understand that nature of uncertainty and use that understanding to help us make better risk decisions. And those decisions can range from what horse to bet on, where to drill for oil, where to deploy troops, whether or not I should bring an umbrella to work. Um, Everything I just mentioned, those are all essentially measurement challenges. And if you add in losses being, of course, the bad thing that happens if you have an adverse event, and you think about what we could or should do to minimize our losses, now that's the very essence of risk management. Yet in the field of cyber risk management, we diverge from that a little bit. We hear that this is impossible. We can't measure intangibles. We can't measure the probability of an event that's never happened. Oftentimes, we hear that measuring probability itself is not possible. We hear stuff like, you can't know all the assets. The threat landscape evolves too quickly to measure. I've heard this many times, I'm sure you all have too. Cyber risk management is uniquely hard and probably impossible. And then I think, maybe they're right. Maybe cyber risk management really is special and unique. After all, there is no other discipline that deals with chaotic, unpredictable, irrational actors. No other risk discipline deals with decision making under high uncertainty or varying degrees of uncertainty. No other risk discipline deals with such a large amount of assets, a large amount of critical assets that they seem uncountable, or events that happen so infrequently, why even bother to forecast them at all? So I recently heard this very passionate argument against performing a risk analysis, and it went something like this. There's never been a breach on blockchain technologies, so how could I possibly do a risk assessment on blockchain? Right, because there's no other risk discipline that performs risk analysis in which that exact event has never happened. People shrug their shoulders. No historical data, can't do it. So, bookies, meteorologists, rocket engineers, geologists, epidemiologists, they all deal with these kinds of questions using math based quantitative risk analysis techniques. So, those of us in cyber risk, we need to start to reframe the way we think about risk. We need to think about the nature of uncertainty, how we think about probability, how we think about forecasting. We have to do all of that if we're going to drive better decisions, if we have any chance of being successful in our jobs. Now, the good news is that trail really has already been blazed for us. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Doug Hubbard's book, The Failure of Risk Management, Why It's Broken and How to Fix It. Came out in 2009. And in that book, Doug Hubbard describes four risk management disciplines. He calls it the four horsemen of risk. And these groups, he groups them out by the types of problems that they face and the methods that they use. Those are how he separates it. And I really like this metaphor that Hubbard uses because it helps us understand how cyber risk fits into the larger world of risk management. So, of the four groups, the first one is war quants. And this is a proud lineage that dates back to World War II. War quants use simulations and a lot of math to drive better decision making in warfare. And the Monte Carlo methods that a lot of us use, especially in FAIR, were developed by physicists working on the Manhattan Project. The next group of risk managers are economists. So here's an interesting fact I like. Did you know that a bond interest rate is the output of a quantitative risk analysis? So economists, financial analysts, and other people in the field use these techniques. Would be really familiar to us to determine optimum risk reward balance. This is actually how I got started in cyber risk. So I have a background in economics, and when somebody first demonstrated for me that the probability of calculating or how to calculate the probability and impact of a cyber event, I said to myself, oh, that's actually really familiar. That is very similar to a bond interest rate. Now, the third group is management consultants, and this is us. This is cyber risk, privacy risk, information risk, business continuity, operational, project risk, many other forms of risk management that's used in business settings. Now, we usually have the lowest level of maturity out of the four horsemen, present company excluded, of course. But we are probably the most dominant group out of the four horsemen. And when somebody talks about risk or Google's risk, takes a class in risk management, this is what they get, what you're seeing on the screen here. So as a result, heat maps, colors, adjectives, performing wacky math functions on adjectives, this has become synonymous with risk management. Although when you consider all of the four horsemen, the entire world of risk, this is actually a minority. Most people use quantitative techniques. And of course, the fourth group, the last of the horsemen, are my buds. These are the actuaries. I love actuaries. These are the OG risk managers. Actuaries have been measuring and managing insurance risk using statistical and scientific methods since the late 1600s at Lloyd's Coffee House in London. And the story behind Lloyd's Coffee House is one of my personal favorites, and it's worth a really brief sidebar here. So, due to its location in London, Lloyd's Coffee House had a really unique clientele of sailors and merchants and ship owners. And the owner, his name was Edward Lloyd, he started to notice this, the types of people that came in, and he started providing up to date shipping information to his coffee drinkers. And people quickly found out that the shipping news from Edward Lloyd that he was passing out, combined with conversations and information from the sailors and merchants, today we might call that expert judgment. But combined with that information, if you just kind of sat in the back of a coffee house and you listened to all of this was a ripe environment for making forecasts about shipping voyages. And then right there, a new industry was born. People started selling shipping insurance right there. And the coffee house is, of course, known today as the insurance powerhouse Lloyd's of London. So when you think about what people were doing in a small coffee house in 1695 London and compare it with what their contemporaries were doing elsewhere, this is the epitome of a rogue actuary. And I think it's amazing. It's an amazing story that they were using quantitative techniques like this way back then. But it turns out that this actually goes further back than this. And I can't think of a better example of rogue actuaries than ancient Babylonians of Hammurabi's time. This is around the 1600s BCE. Now, maritime insurance predates the Babylonians, but they came up with a really unique and innovative way of assessing and managing and transferring shipping risk called bottomry. Now, bottomry doesn't exist anymore, but I think probably the closest modern parallel might be a cat bond, a catastrophe bond. So remember that the world at this time in history didn't have a firm grasp of probability. If you're successful in your shipping venture, you're really at the mercy of the gods. Bad things happen when you fell out of their favor. We had to wait about 4,000 more years for people, for Parisians, people in France, to teach us about probability, modern probability. But this is essentially how bottomry worked. Suppose a ship owner needs a loan and he puts his ship up for collateral. The ship sails out, makes a ton of money by delivering its goods. Now, if the ship makes it back, the loan is repaid with the money from the sale, and you have to pay considerable interest on this. But here's the important part. If the ship is lost at sea, the loan is forgiven. That debt forgiveness, that's the insurance portion. This is why I find this remarkable. So both the ship and the lender have at the very least a mental model of the risk tolerance. And that risk tolerance is anchored in something tangible. It's anchored in money. That's a little bit more than what a lot of companies are doing right now. The interest rate that the lender charges reflects the value of the cargo and the probability of it returning safely. So there's another form of risk analysis. And the lender, with enough business, probably reaches some type of risk equilibrium. And that's a balance of risk and reward. Markowitz calls this the efficient frontier. People were doing this way back then. So here's an interesting thought experiment for you all. So rules governing bottomry were written in the Code of Hammurabi. Bottomry in practice is pretty complex, requires a lot of forecasting skills for the people that were doing it, even if it's just using mental models. So with bottomry, we see the concept of risk transference that we have today, and that risk is articulated in currency, the interest rate. So on some basic level, it's quantitative. So if we got in a phone booth at Circle K in San Dimas and blasted back to Hammurabi's court and presented him with the risk matrix that I put up here on the screen, and we told him, hey, Hammurabi, I want you to use this to manage your shipping risk and your risk transference. How do you think Hammurabi would receive this risk matrix? That's exactly how he would receive it. There's actually more sophistication in Hammurabi's court than this. And so these folks way back then, these are rogue actuaries. And the key point here is that they're unafraid of measurement challenges. Necessity became the mother of invention. So here's a couple more examples. So did you know that any of you here on this webinar, you can buy alien abduction insurance? You can get up to $10 million in coverage. Tom Jones believed that his chest hair was so crucial to his success that he had it insured with a $6.8 million insurance policy. Lloyd's of London, the same people that ran the coffee house way back then, they issued this policy. And this is a little more of a mundane example, but still, in my opinion, no less extraordinary than alien abduction and Tom Jones's chest hair. You probably all remember the Tylenol scare in the 1980s, in which cyanide-laced Tylenol gripped the nation. A few years ago, I think it was about 10 years ago, Zurich and Aon, the insurance companies, they launched reputational risk coverage. So I think that this is more than just another list of weird, wacky insurance policies that you find on Facebook. These are actually remarkable. For these examples, there's no life tables for this. There's no NTSB database. In some cases, there's no list of historical data. Managing insurance risk is an entire industry built on insurance reduction. So what this means here is that an actuary somewhere in the world at some point determined the probability of Tom Jones losing his chest hair, determined the impact of a loss event to Tom Jones, and reduce just enough uncertainty to feel comfortable enough issuing an insurance policy. So they figured out how to do it, and that means that we can too. So what have we learned so far? Issuing an insuring a celebrity's body part, issuing maritime insurance when no one else would do it way back in the 1600s, quantifying the value of a brand's reputation, which, by the way, many risk managers today say it's absolutely impossible to quantify reputation. You also might be surprised to hear that issuing auto insurance was a totally crazy scheme back in 1898. Back then, they only insured horse-drawn carriages. There's no loss table. There's very sparse loss data, but they reduced enough uncertainty to figure out how to issue insurance. So all these examples I've given, from earthquakes to bottomry to the value of Gene Simmons' tongue, these are essentially measurement challenges, risk measurement challenges. Somebody found something that other people consider to be impossible to measure, and they measured it in order to make money. All throughout history, we see this time and time again. What starts out as an outlandish idea often turns into a thriving business later. But I think I really still haven't answered this question. Why? Why do those of us in cyber risk think that quantitative risk analysis, or according to some, any kind of risk analysis, is impossible? Why is this considered too hard to do? The insurance industry proves to us that this isn't true, and they have the money to prove it. Insurance is a thriving business. They have excellent margins. So why do us cyber risk folks think that we have unsolvable measurement challenges and the other three risk horsemen do not? And I think the answer lies in incentives. I think that those of us in cybersecurity are actively disincentivized from using sound techniques like FAIR and other quantitative methodologies to make better management decisions. And I think really this is what the problem is. This is the Ouroboros. It's the imagery of a snake eating its own tail. And I think of this as a really good metaphor to describe the current state of risk management. This represents life, infinity, renewal, wholeness. So standards bodies like PCI, HIPAA, SOC, I'm going to throw in professional certs like CISSP. They create a basic framework for assessing risk. And in order to appeal to the most companies, standards are written broadly, generically, and qualitatively. Management, as we're moving through the cycle here, management, like the board of directors and our senior leadership, they direct us risk managers to build a program that can obtain a SOC 2, a PCI cert, pass an FFIEC or high trust audit. Now, the big four firms have a dual role here. Number one, we hire them to stand up our risk programs and help us with our risk frameworks and develop our risk frameworks internally. But they also independently audit our programs for SOX, SOC 2, HIPAA compliance. And with those two dual competing objectives, the big four firms are going to use the simplest, quickest framework or methodology that they can use to complete the job. And this methodology is almost always qualitative, red, yellow, green. So whether we like it or not, this has become the de facto language of risk, red, yellow, green. There's really no incentive for any of these people on the screen here to do anything better. PCI, SOC 2, HIPAA compliance, it doesn't require anything beyond that. And then the cycle starts again. Big four firms are so large, they influence standards. And what we find is that this exerts enormous pressure on us, the risk managers, the cyber risk managers. We want to achieve board directives. We want to comply with standards. We want to pass an audit executed by the big four, and we still need to find time to sleep at night somehow. So if you're in a company and you're still doing soft risk, qualitative risk, and you feel bad about it, you feel like, oh, I really should do something better, it's okay. I've been there. I think we should all be absolved. There's enormous pressure on us to keep things the way they are. So this works, obviously. Most people are perfectly happy with this arrangement. But this does lead to negative, unintended consequences. And in extreme cases, it leads to a system of perverse incentives. What this means is management and the board are driven by compliance and not by quantifying the return of security investments. Standards bodies are stuck in the past. They have no incentive to evolve because no one's demanding it. And faced with a lack of demand for stronger methods, big four firms do what they do best. They give the customer exactly what they want to comply with standards, no more and no less. And I really can't blame them. You have to make the customer happy. Then it becomes a never-ending cycle, just like the Ouroboros. It's infinity. It renews itself. It becomes this system of wholeness. It's a self-perpetuating ecosystem. So how do we get out of this system of perverse incentives? How do we stop being Hanoi rat catchers? We need to create an environment in which good risk-based decisions are incentivized. And ultimately, we need to get everybody on board. Standards bodies, management, big four, risk managers, everybody. But there must be something we can do today. We're never going to be a profit center like insurance, but I believe that those of us in cyber risk, we can start to try to shift incentives that drive better decisions and make sure that decisions are made for the right reason, not for the wrong reason. And actuarial science has been around for a long time. It's been around much longer than the other horsemen, including management. And there's a ton of lessons that we can learn from them, from the insurance industry. So I have three things, three tips, three lessons that we can all try to start doing today to improve this, to get us all thinking like a rogue actuary. So lesson number one, tip one, skin in the game. So by skin in the game, what this means is People have a personal stake in a successful outcome. It's human nature. People who have something on the line behave differently. And I argue that this is a pervasive problem. Those of us in cyber risk and the people that we ask to make our forecasts, those people, all of us, we don't have enough skin in the game. We don't lose much or anything if there's a poor risk analysis. We also don't gain much if there's a good risk analysis. Why is that? Because making good forecasts isn't the objective. Obtaining a SOC 2, moving items off our risk register, turning all the reds to yellows, making sure there's no findings on an external audit, that's the objective. In other words, it's risk to say we did it. So I want you to consider this. So many companies' risk registers look like this or something like this. A risk register that looks like this actively disincentivizes good risk analysis. With something like this, we're incentivizing poor risk. So a lot has been said about qualitative methodologies and its shortcomings, and I'm not going to rehash the reasons here, but I do have one more shortcoming to throw onto the list. The risk analyst providing forecasts like these, likelihood and impact, these are forecasts, that person has no skin in the game. If the risk analyst says there's a very high likelihood of a data breach and a very high impact, a reasonable person applying some deductive analysis would presume the event is imminent. It's going to be significant, maybe company ending. But what usually happens is that forecast, that original very high likelihood, it's forgotten. We rate SQL injection on a particular build, we mitigate the risk, we close the risk. The red turns into a yellow for at least some period of time. We never go back after a certain period of time and see if that likelihood forecast, that very high, was good or not. And without skin in the game, the risk analyst is incentivized to make risk ratings that support the desired risk mitigation outcome and not true forecasting. I'm sure we've seen this at our companies. So I want you to contrast that with bookies, those are bookmakers, and actuaries. So in practice, the life of a bookie is worlds apart from the life of an actuary, but I think they actually have a lot more in common with each other and with us than we think. So what happens when they make a bad forecast? Actuaries with enough bad forecasts will be out of a job. They get a visit from the Bobs. Bookies with enough bad forecast, they end up in the East River with cement shoes. Now, cyber risk managers, us, with enough bad forecasts, what happens to us? We still get our ISO certification every year. Nothing happens. Why? Because we have no skin in the game. We're missing those feedback loops. And the solution is to create feedback loops. So what would happen if our risk registers resembled fantasy football? And there's a couple ways to gamify risk forecasts to force skin in the game for risk managers and our managers. So many people have experimented with prediction markets to create cyber loss tables. Prediction markets, in order to be effective, require constant feedback from your forecasters about the quality of their forecast. Many cyber risk events take years to come to fruition. It's not always effective to use prediction markets. But what if we use prediction markets to identify super forecasters and keep them calibrated? Now, I have a cool experiment that I ran a couple years back that I want to share with you all. So Richard Seierson, he co-wrote the book, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk with Doug Hubbard. Rich and I used to work together once upon a time, and we implemented something like this. We set out to find the super forecasters in our company. not just in cyber risk, but all super forecasters. And we created a prediction market. We had leaderboards and prizes and um, stuff like that, stuff to make people want to participate. And we asked our company a variety of questions. We asked them who would win the NBA finals? Who would win random basketball games and baseball games? We asked them to predict the weather, the outcome of American Idol. We asked them some short term cyber questions like election hacking and 0-day discoveries. And with those election hacking and 0-day discoveries and data breach questions, we noticed something really remarkable. Super forecasters at our company started to percolate up to the top, and a lot of them were not in the information security team. We started to talk to these folks. Who are you? Why do you know so much about cybersecurity? It turns out that these were news junkies, technologists, people that had a firm understanding of probabilities. We asked them, why do you know so much about probabilities? They took meteorology classes in college. They play a lot of fantasy football. They play a lot of bridge. They play a lot of poker. So we found that the leaderboard, the competition, it served as that continuous and constant feedback loop that you need to improve your forecast. This is what Daniel Kahneman writes about. We found out that it was just by default keeping people calibrated. So we started asking questions to these people outside of the prediction market, like data breach probabilities, ransomware, 0-day, whether or not you thought our company would meet our OKRs, which is really interesting. We had confidence that these people would give us better answers because of the prediction market and the leaderboard and gamifying it. And we used this data to feed our KRIs and our KPIs, which fed our risk program. And next thing you know, we had a ripe environment for incentivizing good decisions. So the lesson with this one is rogue actuaries always have something to lose, and so should we.
For Wednesday, March the 11th at 9 o'clock. They like just to arrive about 15 minutes early just to get through the paperwork portion.
Somebody's mic is on.
You will get a reminder.
Thank you. Okay, lesson number 2, WWFD. So remember back to the beginning, we hear this from people. It's impossible to identify all critical assets. It's impossible to determine the value of IT assets. These are just measurement challenges. These are knowable. Rogue actuaries are unafraid of measurement challenges. They face these challenges head on. So Enrico Fermi, 20th century physicist, he was known for his extraordinary ability to make accurate estimations using very little data, often from memory, using seemingly unrelated data from sources he already had. The good news here is that this ability isn't a genetic trait or something unique to Fermi. This can be learned. Here's an example how. So here's a classic Fermi problem. What's the circumference of the Earth? And you have to know this without Googling anything. And your first thought might be, I don't know. That's impossible. That's like asking me to identify all my critical IT assets. So Fermi came up with a simple way to answer the question. So first, how many time zones? So if you're in a time zone, how many additional time zones do you pass over when you fly from New York to Los Angeles? So that's easy, that's 3. How many miles is it over that same distance? That's general knowledge. It's about 3,000 miles from New York to Los Angeles. How many miles per time zone? I think this is also general knowledge. It's 3,000 divided by 3, it's 1,000. So how many time zones must there be around the world? Well, using deductive reasoning, there must be 24 time zones because there's 24 hours in a day and time zones shift by hour. So it must be 24,000 miles. So 24 time zones times 1,000 miles, that's the circumference of the Earth. It's about 24,000 miles. That's our best guess using Fermi estimation. So let's ask Google, it's 24,901. And this is a quick example, but you can use this, and I have used this in a risk analysis. I've used Fermi estimations to figure out how many laptops we have, how many endpoints, when we don't have a lot of trust in asset inventory. I've used Fermi estimation combined with some sampling to figure out how many vendors store PII or how many vendors have privileged access to our network. And you'd be surprised, it gets pretty close within a range. So the next time you hear somebody say, it's impossible to identify all our critical assets, or it's impossible to count how many open vulnerabilities we have for a risk analysis, ask yourself, what would Fermi do? There's a ton of books out there on Fermi estimation and Fermi problems. There's also some great websites that will teach you how to do this. It's very learnable. And this is what actuaries do. They learn techniques like this. They're unafraid of measurement challenges. And the last lesson, the last tip I have is be the business. So consider this. Think about why we perform a risk analysis. Actuaries are linked to the business. They are the business. And we are an afterthought. We are detached somewhat. And I'm not sure if we can completely change this because we're not a profit center. The type of support type of risk management we perform is support. We're supporting others in the business make better decisions. But I think we can shift ourselves from being thought of as an obstacle to being thought of as a strategic resource, a strategic part of the business. So this happened to me once upon a time. I'm sure this has happened to you, those of you on the call. Somebody came by my desk once and dropped a thick printout. It actually was a printout of a Qualys vuln scan on my desk, and it was at least 300 pages. And I couldn't believe my eyes at this, that somebody actually printed this. Then I couldn't believe my ears. The person said to me, I need a risk analysis, a fair risk analysis of these vulns so that we can prioritize remediation. So let me break this down. So this is essentially what the person was asking me to do. This is a compliance-focused risk analysis process, not risk-based. So decision makers are trying to solve problems all day. So if you want to document non-compliance with a policy, if you want to triage a 300-page vuln scan, if you want to document why you have a finding on your SOX audit, there's better tools at your disposal than a risk analysis. Don't run a risk analysis on a 300-page vuln scan. There's tools out there to do that for you. So if we had, all day, I could tell you all the wacky things I've seen on a risk register like this. You really want to keep it focused to decision making, because that's essentially what risk analysis is. Risk analysis is intended to be uncertainty reduction when you're making a decision. So how do we shift the mindsets of ourselves and the mindsets of our risk managers to this paradigm, instead of thinking that you need to run a risk analysis on a 300-page vuln scan? And it's hard to do. And it really hurts me to think that everybody's risk registers are sometimes a dumping ground of issues that nobody else wants to fix. So if you've seen The Martian, we're going to apply some decision science to this. It's one of my favorite quotes from The Martian, but I want to keep this G-rated. Stanford professor Ron A. Howard has written extensively about decision science and how risk management and risk analysis plays a crucial role in making decisions. Risk analysis is just one tool, one of many tools that we have in our toolbox for making good decisions. And these are the three essentials for making a decision. This is described in Howard's paper, Foundations of Decision Analysis. I walk through these 3 steps before I perform any risk analysis. I identify the choice, and this describes what the decision maker can do. If there's only one course of action, there's no decision to be made. And the second is preferences. The decision maker has to have some preference or inclination or some desired outcome. So in cyber risk, decision makers will usually prefer to optimize user functionality, increase security or have effective security, have efficient allocation of resources like money, time, people, headcount, or some combination of the above. And third, of course, a lot of us are familiar with this, is information. Information is an equal part of this trio when you're making a decision or performing risk analysis. And logic. Logic is the rug that ties this whole room together. Logic's the pillar for the entire process. Without logic, any decision would fail. And this is how I fit this into a risk assessment. There's a lot of ways to use Howard's theory to improve decisions. This is pretty simplified, but this is what I use at Netflix. So the decision maker comes to a point where they need to make a decision. There's always some risk reward component to it. So that decision maker starts to consider performing a risk assessment. That's when they come to me. Now, before I even start the risk assessment, I identify the decision they're trying to make. And we identify the choice, the preferences, and the information that we have. If any one of those 3 things are missing, a risk analysis is probably not the right tool to make that decision. So we want to make a risk reward decision, and then we can start scoping the risk analysis. And that's really all there is to it. This injects us so much earlier on into the decision-making process instead of being an afterthought. And by an afterthought, what I mean by that is you've already made the decision. You've already decided to bring on this vendor with major security issues, and then you're asked to run a risk analysis on all of the risks and issues when the decision's already been made. So again, that's risk to say we did it instead of actually guiding people to better outcomes. So rogue actuaries push the envelope, and I want all of us to start doing that too. So to conclude and summarize, here's a couple of my key points. Risk analysts behave differently when they have something on the line. Be unafraid of measurement challenges. If Enrico Fermi can accurately estimate the strength of an atomic bomb that just exploded by observing pieces of paper that he dropped from his hand during the blast, surely you can estimate the resistance strength of your current patching program. Risk analysis is uncertainty reduction when making a decision. It's nothing more, nothing less. And last, you're not alone. From Hammurabi to people playing dice in the streets of Paris, to a person that issued insurance on Heidi Klum's legs, it's been done. They're still doing it. The answers are out there, and those people don't use the risk matrix. And that's the conclusion of my talk today. You can reach me on Twitter. Here's my Twitter handle. I have my website up. I have my slides. If you're interested in the slides, they're up. I also am a somewhat sporadic blogger. You can check out some of my blog posts. And also feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn too.
Great.
And I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, I think we do. We have a few minutes, and we've got some questions logged in the chat here. So
great.
Let's hit on a couple of those. We're going to forego the chaos theory one. I think that's going to be a long answer. But the first question would be, are you seeing any of the big four change their tune based on what you were talking about, how they essentially put us in this endless loop?
So I'm really pleased to see that a lot of the big four companies are starting to offer quantitative risk analysis as a product. You can go in and request services. You could request them to implement FAIR or something else. And many consulting firms will do that. I think that's a great step forward. But where the point where we're still missing is if you just ask for a quantitative, or you ask for a risk framework, you don't know what you want, they're going to give you red, yellow, green, and we're still missing any type of rigor in standards bodies. So they're going to test you against just really the lowest common denominator.
Great. Hey, Apps, can you throw up the next survey? So while we're doing Q&A, we can have people populate the poll. I assume we've got one. All right, Tony, with the advent of CMMC, we're seeing compliance. Just blocked my thing. Compliance maturity mentality increasing, not decreasing. Many CISOs, even without DoD federal business, like the maturity model at certain levels as a structuring framework for InfoSec programs. This is the antithesis of a measurement of quad approach. How do you see incentives evolving to refocus attention on risk? Looks like we're fighting this battle.
This is tough, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, risk to say we did it. It's compliance to say we did it, or maturity model to say we did it. What I really want to do is think about things in terms of business objectives and how we can drive better decision making. It really is about decisions. I think that the best risk management teams are those that are seen as support and not an obstacle, those that are seen as helping people make decisions rather than move stuff off of a risk register or move stuff off of a compliance report in and off, in and off. We really need to move ourselves earlier in the decision-making process if we're ever going to be successful at this. The companies that have implemented this or are implementing this, something like FAIR, or just even a better structured decision-making process, those are the companies that have a real competitive advantage against their competitors. And I think that's going to be needed in the next few years and decades.
Hey, just a note to all our participants here, we do have a half hour more on the agenda. So we're going to have a networking breakout time followed by a peer review or risk analysis. So if you've got another half hour in your schedule, stick with us here. Great talk, Tony. You're getting all sorts of compliments on the chat here. Oh, there's one more question we'll fire out, and then we'll go to our networking breakout time. So in terms of skin in the game, should cyber risk managers have compensation incentives for their forecasts? For example, some percentage of risk reduction is received in a bonus. That's creative. All right.
I love that idea because there's nothing that talks more than money. I think that the best place we can start is at least start tracking the forecasts that people make. So whether you're using high, medium, low, or probabilities, write that down somewhere. So Bob said that there's a 2% probability of this type of data breach happening in the next 10 years. Let's write that down. And we don't want to punish Bob, but let's provide him continuous feedback on his prior forecast. And I think comp is a great idea. When I worked with Rich Syerson, we used prizes. We couldn't get approval to give money out to people, but prizes seemed to work too. And just the fact that they were on a leaderboard, it was a public or public within the company leaderboard, and people could see each other rising up to the top. It gave them incentive to go out and do their own research and get calibrated and stuff like that.
That's awesome. Hey, did the culture at Netflix influence the way you think about risk or give you the freedom to do the things that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm really lucky at Netflix in the sense that I came in and they're already quantitatively thinking about things. They hire a lot of data scientists and statisticians and stuff like that. And they, people really think quantitatively. And I didn't have to do that fight, that struggle that I almost always have to do when I start a new FAIR program. They were really forcing me to get more rigor and get things started up faster. And I think that just the culture that Netflix has, it really lends itself to decision making instead of risk to say we did it. We use risk almost exclusively for decision making. We don't have a typical risk register, a traditional risk register where we move stuff on and off. We only tie it to company decisions.